evening. This is the India Development Debate right here on ET Now. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and ending months of speculation and bringing sanity back to the RBI reserve sharing discourse. The central bank today set up a 6-member panel on capital reserve transfer that will, besides many other things, look at the amount of reserves RBI needs to retain, share with the government, and risk provisioning the central bank needs to do. Former RBI Governor Bimal Jalan will head the panel, and appointment of the known detractor of RBI reserves, Rakesh Mohan, on the committee has impressed the naysayers as well. Besides the two, for RBI governors, of course, we've got Bharat Doshi, Sudhir Mankad, and DA Secretary Subhash, Chandra, Garg, and RBI Deputy Governor Vishwanathan also on the panel. The expert committee will have 90 days from the first meeting, which virtually rules out recommendations impacting reserve share for this financial year. The return of sanity and credibility to the RBI is the big topic we are discussing right here on the India Development Debate this evening. We are breaking format, and we are really going to when the news broke on the show this evening. The Reserve Transfer Committee ending the whole discourse about quote-unquote raiding of reserves is what we are tracking for you here on the show. I'll take you across to a conversation that we had with multiple experts as the news came. Mr. R. Gandhi with me on the phone line, and thank you very much, Mr. Gandhi, for being with us. RBI has constituted the expert committee on economic capital framework. There were lots of people who feared they will get all the yes men, they will get people who would want reserve to be transferred. But truth be told, they've got people like Rakesh Mohan, who have been very known, advocates of no reserve transfer happening at will. Are you surprised? Are you impressed with this composition?
See, the point is about the Reserve Bank has constituted its committee to advise its board, right? So naturally, the people who have the good knowledge about the Reserve Bank way of functioning, its position as a monetary policy maker, and the intricacies of the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank, all those things, all those knowledge is definitely needed for a person to be on that kind of committee. So that way, it is not a surprise at all that such personalities have been chosen to be on the committee. They have rich experience about the way a central bank is supposed to function. They have hands-on experience also. So that will definitely help give them for them to give sage advice to the board.
No, absolutely. But you know what is interesting are the terms of reference. Of course, they have to give a report in the 90 days from their first meeting, this committee. But it also very clearly states that this will determine whether the RBI is holding provisions, reserves and buffers in surplus or deficit of the required level of such provisions. There are many people out there who believe that the RBI's reserves are far more than what the global practice is. The global practice is mid-teens. The RBI is holding about 25% of reserves. How do you believe that argument is going to go? This is not just about reserve transfer. This is also going to review the position that the RBI needs to have on the quantum of reserves it holds.
Yeah, see, reserve transfer, whatever it is, that comes as a byproduct of all these things. So first of all, what is required is that what is the kind of balance sheet strength the central bank should have. So the balance sheet strength comes out of capital, the retained reserves, and the provisions, various provisions made, and the other kind of building up the reserve. So it is a complete or a comprehensive view will have to be taken before, because that's what the Act says. Act clearly says that after making all the provisions required for the Reserve Bank, the surplus will be transferred to the government. So the surplus is a byproduct after meeting all these requirements. So that's why it is correctly, the terms of reference have been correctly stated.
How do you read this statement? And I'm going to read this out to you. One of the terms of reference is to propose a suitable profit distribution policy taking into account all the likely situations of the RBI, including the situations of holding more provisions than required and the RBI holding less provisions than required. Are they really, in some sense, telling the committee to take both scenarios into account? You know, when currency volatility and all of that is a lot higher, you need more reserves. When the currency is stable, you perhaps need less reserves. So the committee is going to make up its mind on what percentile of reserves does the RBI really need to hold. Should it be over 20 like the RBI presently does? But also on less reserves. How would you read this statement, Mr. Gandhi?
Yeah, because whatever policy that this committee should be recommending, that should stand good for across all type of situations, like where the foreign exchange surplus, foreign exchange deficit, or by FT going up, going down. So in an economy with the business cycles all around, any kind of situation can be forthcoming in down the line. So yeah, the policy should be able to take care of every type of situation. So that's why I would read that particular reference from that perspective, not the current requirement or the current demand from the government that is supposed to be transferred. That is a short-term view. You have to have a complete understanding of every possible situation, and in each possible situation, what kind of balance sheet strength the Reserve Bank should have. So that's the right way of doing it.
No, Mr. Gandhi, just a very quick question. The expert committee will have to submit its report within a period of 90 days from the date of its first meeting. Do we presume that what it recommends can actually come in this fiscal year itself? I know we just have broadly 90 days in this financial year from, in the Jan to March quarter. But do we expect the report to be, executed and worked upon in this financial year itself?
Because Reserve Bank year is different from government fiscal year. Government fiscal year is from April to March, whereas Reserve Bank's accounting year is from July to June. So after 90 days, when this committee gives its recommendation, the board will have sufficient time, further time to decide on by accepting the recommendation and implementing thereof. So that we have almost 6 full months available.
Okay, and there is this, because there is this wide speculation in New Delhi that there could be an interim dividend and all of that. You believe that is irrespective of this, or will the interim dividend have to wait what the final report of the expert committee on capital framework says, economic capital framework says?
The demand for interim dividend is totally a different one, but that is a current for the present, for the current year. So that I would expect that would be dealt with by the Reserve Bank separately, and not this committee may not necessarily be giving a recommendation on that one small issue. If at all, as a principle, what kind of transfers, profit transfers, the government, Reserve Bank should be doing to government over the period, whether it should be at one go, whether it can be in installments, those kind of discussion, definitely this committee, I would expect them to apply that point. But for the current year, I don't think this committee will look into the current issue.
Okay, will not perhaps look at the current issue, but only going forward, and that should address some of the skeptics who've been very, very skeptical of any reserve talk as far as the RBI is concerned. Mr. Gandhi, before I let you go, a quick final word. You've been Deputy Governor RBI. In terms of the quantum of reserves that the RBI holds versus the global best practices, there are experts out there who've pointed out that the RBI holds far more than required. Of course, it's the equity of the government sitting as an asset with the RBI, which is a top-rated entity, institution. But given the global best practice, is there scope for that money being transferred? Is that scope for that money being given to the government?
See, as of now, there is no global standards fixed by either by IMF or by Basel or something like that. There is no such prescribed tenets. So when we compare different central banks' balance sheet, different assumptions are there. So I would naturally, this committee will go to that. When you say some X central bank has 10%, Y central bank has 20%, whether are we comparing apples to apples? That will certainly be factored in by this committee, I would suppose. After that, only you can come to the conclusion whether Reserve Bank has excess or less or whatever. So simple comparison of numbers across the countries straight away, it won't cut ice. That should not be done. That is a very simplistic way of looking at the reserves of central banks.
No. Fair point. Mr. Gandhi, also very quickly, this committee also has to suggest an adequate level of risk provisioning. that the RBI needs to maintain. And I think that really emanates from the answer that you just gave, that there are no global stipulated best practices. The IMF or the World Bank haven't, come out with norms like, say, the Basel norms for banks. Given that, what sort of risk provisioning is needed for an economy like ours?
You can draw certain conclusions from the general standards that has been prescribed for financial institutions, because that will be the starting point. And by being a central bank, you would always expect that to be higher than the standards should have been. Normally one would expect to be tighter than what is applied to a standard financial institution. So that will be a very quick starting point to a position. So that's what I would think, that it is not that there are certain commonalities will be there between several central banks. That could be kind of taken as a cue on which the recommendation could be made. Anyway, I won't want to prejudge predict what this committee will do. Let us hope that we will look in. I will also be looking for the final wisdom of this committee.
Fair point indeed. On that note, thank you very much, Mr. R. Gandhi, for being with us. I'm going across to another very special guest. Dr. Arvind Mayaram joins us, former Department of Economic Affairs Secretary. He'd been on the board of the RBI and, of course, India's Finance Secretary. Dr. Mayaram, you know what perhaps leaves me a little impressed in this entire economic capital framework is the constitution of the committee, to be headed by Bimal Jalan, and the vice chairman is none other than Rakesh Mohan, somebody who's written extensively on this economic capital framework, somebody who's been very vocal and eloquent against reserves being transferred to the RBI. What do you first make of the capital framework committee before we move forward?
Well, I think it's a good move, and I would say that the members who have been put on the committee have a very high degree of credibility. They have one of the finest economic brains in the country. So I'm confident that they will come up with something that would, going forward, bring some sanity into the discussion about whether the reserve should be large or small, etc.
No, fair point indeed. I think this is going to bring some sanity and some, if I may also say, also some maturity to this very ill-informed, misinformed discussion. But if I may quickly go to the terms of reference, and starting with point number 1, to review the status, need and justification of various provisions, reserves and buffers presently provided by the RBI, and review global best practices followed by central banks in making assessment and provision of risk which central bank balance sheets are subject to. The question here is that there is a lot of criticism that's leveled at the RBI that the quantum of reserves is far higher than some of the other central banks around the world do and hold. Is that a valid argument, and is the committee being, the attention of the committee is being drawn into an area there, which is how much reserves need to be held by the RBI? We'll talk about transfer next.
Yeah, actually, there is a lot of confusion in the minds of the people who are talking about these reserves, because much of it is notional in nature, in the sense that they have gold reserves. As the prices go up and down, there is a valuation of that, and therefore it appears to be a very large sum. If the gold prices suddenly shoot up, the value of that becomes very large, and if it starts dropping, then it will shrink. So similarly, it is with the foreign exchange reserves also. I think there is a kind of a confusion in the minds of the people who are talking about these reserves. But I think it's a very good step because once this entire issue has gone into threadbare, then we would have a much clearer picture of how the reserves are formed, how they are valued, what is actually the liquidity in these reserves, whether they are liquid or illiquid. All these issues will be discussed threadbare by the committee, I presume. And at the end of the discussion, we will know exactly where the RBI stands vis-a-vis the reserves.
Okay, where the RBI stands vis-a-vis the reserves is an interesting point that you talk about. But Dr. Mayaram, I also want to ask you specific questions on some of the other provisions. to suggest an adequate level of risk provisioning that the RBI needs to maintain. Now, ours is obviously a developing economy. Our need for reserves is perhaps different, and our provisioning, risk provisioning, is different. What do the framers of this committee really have in mind when they talk about risk provisioning that the RBI needs to maintain?
Obviously, the kind of risks we see in the volatility in the economic cycles that the country goes through. Unfortunately, globally, we are seeing that these cycles are becoming shorter, and therefore, to tide over this volatility, to smoothen the creases, the Reserve Bank of India must be adequately provisioned in terms of the reserve. And so therefore, I think all these issues will be taken into account.
Maram, to determine whether the RBI is holding provisions, reserves and buffers in surplus, deficit or deficit of the required levels of provision, is this committee also seemingly more open than the debate that was ongoing? Because the debate was all about, how do you transfer excess capital and all of that. At least the terms of reference of this committee are also alluding to the fact that there may be instances, and especially in currency volatility, like you yourself pointed out, where the reserves could actually be deficit and the RBI needs to have more reserves. Is that the thinking also somehow?
Comprehensively look at the requirement of the RBI. They would also look at the historical trend in terms of how these reserves have come into use in the past. They would also see the psychological impact it has on the markets in terms of how well the Reserve Bank of India is provisioned. They will also take a look at how the rupee behaves and how the rupee stabilization requirement of the RBI is met. I think they will comprehensively look at all the issues and then provide a roadmap going forward.
Dr. Mayaram, before I let you go, and the question, of course, has to do with a lot of speculation here in New Delhi about, the reserves right now. And there is this, obviously, the committee has a 90-day deadline to submit its recommendations from the date of its first meeting. Do you believe we could perhaps see, we could perhaps see the report come in before the end of this financial year? And could that alter the reserve transfer at all for this financial year? That's question number one. And I know I'm just trying to understand from someone who knows this better. And the second question is, there is a lot of speculation out there that there could be an interim dividend transfer that is likely to happen to the government, this financial year before the July deadline. Could either of the two pictures be altered?
Well, I cannot say anything about the dividend part. I mean, that is something that the board will take a call on, and it could depend on how much the board and the governor are willing to risk in terms of the psychological impact the amount would have on the markets. That is a call they will take. But I don't see, as far as the current financial year is concerned, because if the budget is going to be presented sometime in the early part of February, and if the deadline is 90 days, which is 3 months, which would be perhaps starting, even if they start on 1st of January, the posts come much after the budget has already been presented. So I don't think the reflection of any large transfers that the committee may presumably recommend will have an impact in the current year's, in the current financial year.
Okay. On that note, Dr. Mayaram, thank you very much for being with us. Joining us also on the show are two very special guests. We've got Dr. Pranab Sen, and I'm given to understand I've also got Dr. Ashima Goyal with me. Thank you very much, both of you, for being with us. And Ms. Goyal, if I may begin with you, a lot of people are very pleasantly surprised that the RBI hasn't gone, and Maithili Bhurstunbhat, her consulting editor, continues to be with us. And if Dr. Mayaram agrees to stay, it will be great to have your views as well. But Dr. Goyal, a lot of people were very skeptical about the constitution of this committee. You've got a very known detractor of reserve transfer, somebody like Rakesh Mohan being the vice chair of this committee. Should one breathe a sigh of relief that this is not full of people who are going to say yes to transfer instantly?
Yes, I think we have a very good representation from both the RBI and the Finance Ministry, people with past experience of both the RBI and the Finance Ministry and an understanding of issues. Dr. Bimal Jalan is a very sort of center person who believes a lot in correct governance and incentives. So he's an excellent choice to head the committee. And I'm sure this will take a very considered view, bringing in sort of all sides of the issue and work out something that will be in the best interest of the nation.
I'll take this across to Dr. Pranab Sen. And like a lot of people, I think, all of us have at one point or the other shared a concern on the constitution of this committee with people like Bimal Jalan and Rakesh Mohan and of course Bharat Doshi and Sudhir Mankad, who are directors on the RBI board. DA Secretary, a very strong proponent of reserve transfer. Dr. Rakesh Mohan, through his many articles, are very strong detractors of the reserve transfer. Is this evenly balanced, the committee, to begin with, Dr. Sen?
It's a very good composition. I must compliment the government on the composition of the committee, or the RBI. I don't know who did the selection. It's an excellent balance. It has people who are familiar not just with the operations of the RBI. It has people who are familiar with the operations of the markets at large, people who are aware of the implications for the macroeconomy. So, by and large, I think it's a great composition.
Indeed, but Dr. Sen, if I may quickly go across some of the terms of reference that this committee has, and one such terms of reference is to not just review the status, need and justification for various provisions, reserves and buffers, to also review global best practices. Now, there are arguments out there, and I'm going to take this question with both you and Dr. Ashima Goel, of course, with Maithili. There are arguments out there that have pointed us in the direction that a lot of central banks don't have the quantum of reserves that we do. The quantum of reserves for them is far lower than our own quantum of reserves. I first want to get your view on this before I move any forward. Dr. Sen.
Let me put it to you this way. The notion of best practice is a nebulous concept. It really depends upon the structure of the economy. So a lot of the things that are called best practices are in countries where the currency is freely tradable. Ours is not. Now, that puts special responsibilities. The second is that countries differ in the manner in which currency is created. In our system, currency can only be created through either purchase of government bonds or purchase of foreign exchange, each of which has very large consequent effects on the macroeconomy. So keeping these in mind, to be able to say that country X has reserves of so much percent of their liabilities, and therefore we should do the same, simply doesn't make sense. You really have to take the specifics of the structures under which the central bank operates. So it's a good idea to review the practices, and I won't even call them best practices, review the practices of other central banks, look at the kind of risks that they have been talking about, look at whether we have additional risks that we have to cope with, and then take a call. But the good thing about all of this is that once you lay all of this out on the table, when the RBI announces how much of its profits is going to retain as reserves, it actually has to provide an explanation in terms of the parameters that they will be using to determine that. And that, I think, is important information for people at large and for the markets in particular.
No, absolutely, that it is. Dr. Ashima Goel, very quickly, if I may come to you, and I think Dr. Sen makes a very important point that, this committee has people who understand not just macroeconomy, but understand the financial markets and all of that also very well. But one of the terms of provision is to suggest an adequate level of risk provisioning that the RBI needs to maintain, and to determine whether the RBI is holding provisions, reserves and buffer both in surplus or deficit of the required levels of such provisions, reserves and buffers. Is there a tacit admission that in times of volatility, in times of, when the currency goes haywire or gold and all of that, one needs to have, one needs to have more buffer, more reserves than required? So is there a tacit admission? Because right now the debate has always been that the RBI is sitting on these reserves and some of the surplus should be transferred to New Delhi. And may I dare say, we in media are responsible for some of that misinformed, ill-informed, inadequately informed debate as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that we need to work it out from first principles, and as Dr. Pranav is saying, related to the context and specific risks that arise for an emerging market subject to volatile inflows. But I think they will look at the historical, what has been the requirement, and then take a position. But and so it will be reasoned, and it will be formula based. So it is not a hello.
Go ahead, ma'am. We can hear you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, ma'am. We can hear you clearly.
So it will be based on a formula, and it won't be subject to this political, that they want these reserves, they want to use them. And also the timing of the committee, and as someone was saying, to come after the budget, then it won't be as if they are using it in the election year. And I'm sure they'll be very, very careful, even if they announce some transfer, that it will be, linked to, say, recapitalizing banks or retiring government debt, rather than being used to bolster the budget. So I think that this is a very well constituted committee. The timing should allay some of these market fears. The government wants to appropriate the Reserve Bank's reserves.
Right. Dr. Pranab Sen, if I will quickly ask you this question, because there was always this doubt. This committee has a 90-day period from the date of its first meeting to submit a report, and there is always this speculation that was this money going to be used for political, sops for polls and all of that. Does this set the record straight that even with these recommendations, the reserves for this financial year are perhaps going to not be impacted?
Absolutely. I think Mr. Mayan,
does that address that concern, Dr. Sen?
Yes, it does indeed. The thing is that the government, having set the committee up, is very unlikely to preempt the committee in any sense. And since 3 months takes you past the February deadline, you shouldn't expect to see anything happening in the budget documents, which doesn't necessarily preclude, and here we are really talking about a very thin line, it doesn't necessarily preclude the government from taking a large chunk, let's say on 31st of March, and standing down the fiscal deficit for the current year. But that will leave them with, at best, 1 day to do it. I don't think the government's going to do it. I think the clear message the government is sending out is that, put at rest the fears of the RBI reserves being used for election spending. And that, I think, is an important message, and it should cheer everybody up.
And besides cheering people up, I think it becomes, like I think Dr. Mairam said, if I'm not wrong, that it also marks the return of sanity to this whole discussion on capital framework. But let me quickly take this across to Dr. Ashima Goyal as well. And, there was this concern, and now, of course, there's this fresh speculation that there could be an interim dividend coming in from the RBI, which has come for the last 4 years, but it has come only in the month of July. The speculation was it could come previously. Is this also, and let's be fair here, is this also, assertion of the fact that the government and the RBI are talking? There is finally a man there who has a direct line with New Delhi. He is doing things independently, but he's taking the government into confidence. I mean, I personally think that the appointment of Rakesh Mohan as the vice chairman of this committee is an extremely important development that we are perhaps not speaking of as much as we should. Because he's written 3 columns, and all those 3 columns have been most quoted by people who've detracted this move. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, I agree that Rakesh Mohan has come out very clearly in favor of large reserves. So you have people with opposing views, and they will argue with each other and work out some sort of compromise or agreement, bringing in both sides of the issue. So it's a very healthy composition.
And on that note, we'll take a really quick breather, but we come back with a fascinating conversation with none other than the architect of the data privacy debate right here in India. Justice Sri Krishna is in conversation with us over many issues that are irking citizens all across the country. Is the government being the big brother snooping on all of us? Is there a surveillance law that's really coming into place? Many such moves, and we'll come back to all of that in just a moment in a fascinating conversation with Justice Sri Krishna right here on the India Development Debate.